Hello, everyone. Good morning and afternoon, depending on your time zone. I'm Julia Arnold. I am the Senior Director of Gender and Financial Inclusion at CFI. I am so delighted that you are all here joining us with me this morning. Morning, my time. Before we start the webinar panel discussion today, I wanted to take a second to highlight some of the amazing content that you will find on the Financial Inclusion Week site, the Feedloop site. We have myriad podcasts, quizzes, blogs, etc. For your perusal and information and learning. There are some absolutely wonderful events happening later today, including some that already happened early in this morning. And please do explore the site and discover the great content. There's a blog that went live today on social norms and financial inclusion, which I would be delighted for you to listen to and provide some feedback. Great. All right, let's get started. So today we are excited to welcome three panelists with deep knowledge and experience on building women's financial capability and what that looks like. First, on our panel today, we have Ella Moffat. Ella manages BSR's HERfinance Digital Wages Program in partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, and the Levi Strauss Foundation. The program increases financial inclusion in global supply chains by supporting wage digitization for low-income garment workers, especially women, in Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Egypt, while also increasing supplier efficiency and transparency. Next, we have Wendy Chamberlin. Wendy serves as the Global Program Director for the BOMA Project. The BOMA Project is a livelihood development program that leverages the poverty graduation approach to support entrepreneurial growth and household level resiliency in arid, semi-arid land counties in northern Kenya and in Uganda. Since 2009, the BOMA Project has enrolled over 33,000 pastoralist women in its program. As Global Program Director for BOMA Project, Wendy focuses on expansion and innovation of BOMA's poverty graduation program through partnerships with the government of Kenya, private sector, and the social sector. And finally, we have Nisha Singh. Nisha is the social norms technical lead for FinEquity. She has over 15 years of experience promoting access to finance and financial market systems development with a focus on women's economic empowerment and inclusion. She has worked with a range of institutions from small NGOs to multilateral donors, private sector actors, and policymakers to promote access to finance and market systems development. We are so delighted to have all three of these brilliant women on our panel today. Here we are. I forgot I'm in charge of the slides. Before we begin our conversation, I just wanted to give a very brief overview of each of the organizations and what they do, so you have a sense of where we're coming from, very different perspectives, which is exciting. So the HER Project is a global organization that works with over 14 country partners, with factory workers and local implementing partners to unlock the full potential of working women in global supply chains. As you can see, they've worked with over the years over 1 million women and over 500,000 men, which is an enormous reach, both within the factories and within the communities. The BOMA Project is a livelihood development program that leverages the poverty graduation approach to support entrepreneurial growth and household level resiliency in northern Kenya. Let's see here. They work with the extreme poor who live on $1 a day, and they build skills and access to private and public sector that includes that ensures long-term growth for their businesses. And finally, we have FinEquity, which is a global community that aims to advance women's financial inclusion globally. It's convened by CGAP, and it provides facilitated platforms to share experiences, identify key challenges, and document and discuss emerging good practices and solve common problems associated with increasing equitable access to and use of broad range of financial services. So we are very excited to have these three perspectives for our conversation today. So our conversation today is around financial capability. And before we can, talk about innovations in financial capability, we kind of have to define it. So financial capability is a key research area for CFI. We've been working in this area for a number of years now, and we have been a vocal proponent of moving beyond traditional classroom-based financial education to a more behaviorally informed approach to building financial capability, where there's increasing evidence that nudges, just-in-time delivery, and customized approaches can have impacts on attitudes and behaviors. The landscape of financial services and products that include a form of capability building is increasing, which is very exciting, from female agent networks that offer customized training to users to government conditional cash transfer programs that encourage savings behavior. In fact, CFI is currently conducting a global landscape of financial capability innovations, which will be out next year. So as you can see from the screen, there are a variety of definitions of financial capability, but the one that we'll be using today and the one that you find most commonly is the combination of knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behavior change to support long-term financial decision-making. So from the examples you'll hear today, you'll notice that we use quite a broad definition of financial capability, expanding beyond just basic financial knowledge around compound interest to ask, what does it mean to be financially capable? Business skills, networks, inter-household decision-making, the type of delivery channel, and digital capability all contribute to building financial capability. This is particularly true for women. Women face additional barriers in knowledge, literacy, numeracy, as well as constraints on their time with disproportionate care responsibilities, limited or unequal control over household resources. To all this, we must consider digital capability, access to, and confidence with technology are increasingly important considerations to building a woman's financial capability. While many services are still delivered in person, the global pandemic has forced many providers to enter a digital space to varying degrees of success. Approaches to building women's financial capability must take these differences in access and use and confidence between men and women into account in order to be successful. For example, inter-household dynamics around who is the provider may create barriers to women benefiting from financial capability-focused products and services. Men are often presumed to be the primary income earner, and normative expectations reinforce this role. As such, when a woman builds a livelihood from selling cooked food or fruits or other micro business that she might run, she often hides that income for fear that her male partner will steal it or demand a portion of it. Where does financial capability building come into play in this dynamic? Today, we'll discuss a range of approaches to building digital and financial capability from quite varied experiences. Delivery channel and design are the front and center of this conversation. How are we reaching our female clients, and what tools are we leveraging to help them improve their lives? I'd like to hand it over to Ella Moffat, who will speak about the HER project, how they build financial capability among female factory workers. Ella?
Perfect, thank you. And yeah, financial capability is just so vital for what we do, and we support low-income workers to be able to accept and benefit from wage digitization. And according to the 2017 FinDex, 230 million adults are being paid private sector wages in cash, including millions of garment workers, of which the majority are women. And cash wages are really inefficient and risky for employers and workers. Workers go home on payday with a full month's wages in cash on them, which is it's just not very safe. And cash is really harder to manage and save. It's the same for all of us. If you have cash in your pocket, you're more likely to spend it. It can also be lost or stolen. And cash wages are also disempowering for women who have less control over their wages because they're easier to hand over or to be taken from them. And so the majority of workers receiving cash because the majority of workers receiving cash wages are unbanked, therefore digitising wages has got a real potential to increase financial inclusion for millions of them, especially for women, giving them access to their first financial account. But as you all know, access does not necessarily lead to usage on its own. So building financial capability for workers, especially for women, is a really vital part of wage digitisation. So they can build the knowledge and confidence they need, not just to access their new payroll accounts, but be able to use them with confidence and ultimately to benefit from them. Otherwise, workers are likely to just simply withdraw 100% of their wages on payday. It might also encourage workers, especially women, to hand over control of their accounts to others because they don't know how to use them or lack confidence to go to cash out points. And so I'm going to stop there and hand over to Wendy.
Thanks, Ella, and thanks, Julia. Thanks for having us on here as well. It's great to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the BOMA project builds financial capability with regards to the populations we work with, specifically in northern Kenya. For those of you who are not familiar with the terminology around poverty graduation or the graduation model, what it is meant to imply is the graduation of an individual out of extreme poverty, not from poverty itself. But graduation, this concept was, this approach was really, it started with BRAC to address the fact that microfinance and traditional microfinance and formal financial services for the poor were really leaving out the extreme and ultra poor. Because if you don't have enough assets to save, where are you going to put how are financial services relevant for you? So the graduation approach enters in really at the early stages of saying what needs to be done to even provide assets and asset growth so that individuals have something to save. So we have adapted the graduation approach. And for those of you who are familiar with this model, you'll see charts that look a lot like this. And we provide and promote a time-bound sequence set of interventions, which are meant to both target and identify the ultra poor, and then bring them to a place of ease of use and familiarity with financial services. And that's done through ongoing mentorship and training over a 2-year period of time, combined with an early asset transfer. So much that we do goes beyond just providing money. The coaching and mentoring that is provided in the program are what research tells us, both at BOMA but globally on the graduation approach, are critical to building financial capability. And so when you see these steps, and on the next slide I'll go through these a little bit more, you'll see that each of these are critical to building financial capability. And Ella said it just right. So often we talk about, in the world of financial inclusion, access being the real deal. And we all know from all the studies where this falls short. And so by looking at the multiple components that can help an individual grow their asset base and build, I'll use the jargony word of resiliency, but it's truly what it is. We understand that this is a complex undertaking. And what I want to highlight, and what you see here on this slide, these again are the steps that we undertake over a 2-year period to onboard a person to our program. So I mentioned there's targeting, there's a cash transfer, there's training on financial services, there's mentoring and coaching that expands even into life skills training. There's provision of savings and access to credit. And we also do a lot to bolster and to kind of connect the dots with market linkages. And I think what's key to all of this is the recognition that no individual, when it comes to thinking about their financial capability, is simply thinking about it from the standpoint of what's in their bank account. They're trying to figure out on a day-to-day basis how to mobilize resources to pay for very practical things like school fees, how to weather the next shock, like what we have in northern Kenya, where floods have come, and on Saturday, several families had thousands of heads of livestock completely, killed. And so how do you respond in a very practical way? And so we see the need for having sort of this this multi-step approach, and also therefore using multi-sectoral indicators to measure financial capability in order to really determine how sort of financially healthy an individual and a household is. Over to you, Julia. Or to Nisha, sorry.
Thanks, Wendy. Hi, everyone. My name is Nisha, and thank you, Julia and CFI, for organizing this interesting discussion. I'm going to talk a little bit about something we hear as one of the big barriers to building women's financial capability, women's financial inclusion opportunities, social norms. Almost everything we've read in the last 5 to 10 years talks about the gender gap in women's financial inclusion and says, social norms are responsible for it, but the conversation often stops there. So I'm going to spend some time talking about what these social norms are and how do they impact women's lives and create gender-specific barriers for women to be more financially capable and included. So in the simplest of terms, social norms regulate what behavior is normal. Social norms are group rules that define obligatory, recommended, acceptable behavior in a group of people. They're rules we follow because we want to fit in. It's what I do because others expect me to do this. So, you leave a tip for a waiter at a restaurant, there's no law that's asking you to do that, but if you don't comply, either the waiter's going to think you're cheap or probably not serve you better, at least in certain countries. So that's an example of a norm. And norms are not always a bad thing, that they are in place and they keep society functioning. These are collective rules that we've agreed to abide by so that we can have a functioning society. But next slide. But when these rules are gendered, which means that they describe how people of a particular gender are expected to behave in a specific context, specific social context, then they could become a barrier. This slide has a bunch of statements that we've seen in some form or the other. And when you listen to these statements, they are rooted in gendered social norms, which are a subset of any kind of norms. And what they often reflect is unequal gender relations. And they usually disadvantage women and girls who do not conform to this prevailing expectation of how they should function within the context of their household, their community, and the larger financial market system. So, statements like managing money and finances is a man's job. When women step into these roles, they're breaking those rules. And that means that there might be repercussions for them, anything ranging from being ostracized to the extreme of gender-based violence. Gender norms that underpin these kinds of attitudes about what is acceptable for a woman to do are deeply rooted in fundamental expectations of men and women's economic and household roles. And they limit and shape what is possible for a woman long before a woman actually even interacts with a financial service provider. They impact self-confidence, what kind of preferences she has, her behaviors, because she knows that this is what is expected of her, and there would be consequences for not following those rules. Next slide. So to understand how social norms and gender norms play out in the context of women's financial inclusion, the socioecological model is useful in understanding how several layers of factors influence a particular behavior. So the socio-ecological framework can explain how these barriers to women's financial and economic opportunities play out and are held in place. The model considers the complex interplay between individual, household, community, and systemic factors that act as a barrier to women's financial inclusion. Next slide. So if we take this in the context of specifically women's financial inclusion, at the individual level, we see, women have limited access to mobile phones. They often have reduced confidence. What are the norms that underpin these outcomes or at the individual level? For example, we've heard a few studies around how norms related to women's purity in India impact their ability to actually use a phone, because the perception is if a woman has a phone, then she's going to be able to communicate to men who she shouldn't be talking to. So that norm that shapes, what is appropriate behavior for a woman means that she doesn't have access to a tool that can help her advance economically. There are perceptions and norms around, how educated a girl should be, because if she's too educated, then maybe she cannot get married. If she's really good at math or science, that might, impact her chances of finding a suitable husband. So in a lot of cultures, girls are not sent to into higher education. That means in general, women have lower levels of literacy. There's when you're constantly told that women are not good at math or using technology, they also internalize that, and that often results in reduced confidence in actually using financial services or interacting with the financial service provider. Julia had mentioned at the beginning restrictions on mobility. In so many cultures, in the name of women being protected and ensuring their safety, women are not allowed to leave the house unaccompanied or take public transport. But what that really means is if you have to go attend a training class, or you have to go to a bank branch, you have to take time out of your day, and you need somebody to go with you. So all of these normative barriers start to normative influences start to create barriers for what a woman can do and how she can interact with financial services, and it reduces her ability to leverage her own knowledge and skills. These barriers exist at the household level in the form of, women often are not the decision maker, because that is, again, a norm that in a married relationship, the man makes the rules of where the money is spent. But women need to comply with that, else they're challenging his role. And not just at the household, but often in the case of a financial market system, these norms get baked into how financial products are designed and what kind of policies are in place. So we've seen credit products where there's a requirement for having your husband as a signatory, which is good for the financial institution, but can be limiting for the woman if she wants to start her own business or have financial independence. Next slide. Yep, sorry. I'll just go back. So this is a summary of how norms and the resulting behaviors limit women's financial capability, their ability to have the knowledge, the skills, and the information to act upon it to then meaningfully use financial services and advance economic opportunities. I'll pass it on.
Great, thanks, Nisha. And tackling social norms and gender norms within wage digitization is so important because, you know, being paid into accounts, learning how to use, access, use and benefit from them is a bigger step for women. And if it's not addressed within the training, then actually women are much less likely to be able to benefit from those accounts. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the HER project partnership that we have with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in Bangladesh, where we've been working together since 2015 to pilot digital wages. And we focus on the garment sector because there's a high concentration aggregation of workers, especially women, who are paid in cash. So it's a really good starting point. Through the programme, we work with managers to help them to prepare and deliver wage digitisation that considers the needs of female workers who make up around 58% of the workforce. So it's really important for them to understand the challenges that they face. We also provide gender responsive training and support for workers to enable them to be able to use their accounts and to benefit from them, to increase their financial resilience and their control over their wages. And so one of the ways that we do this is through peer educator training. So we identify peer educators who are about 5% of the workforce, and we provide them with monthly training, which is 3 hours each month, held over 6 months around financial services and financial health. And then they in turn share their learning with around 20 of their peers. And the training is for both male and female workers because it's really important to engage men within this. And there's a session around talking about finances with your family to support the workers, especially the women, to have more control over how their wages are spent. And it's really important to understand any unintended consequences that can come. You can't go from handing over your wages because you have to hand it over to your father or your husband to suddenly saying, no, this is my money and I'm going to have control and I'm going to have say about it. You have to be done through negotiation, communication skills, and also engaging men. It's really, really important. And through the training, we also deliver training for middle managers, which is also really important because workers will ask their supervisors about their new payroll products and how to use them. And we have town hall training for all of the workers a month before they're paid digitally so that they can have an opportunity to ask questions and to learn a little bit more about the products. We also have posters and play messages over the PA system. Such as not sharing PIN numbers. So essentially have multiple levels of training and information across the factory. So there are lots of different ways and means for workers, especially for women, to be able to learn about their new accounts, how to use them, how to other ways that they can benefit from them, and to be able to ask questions, which is really important. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Julia. And so this programme has seen a really positive impact for both women and for business. And we found that wage digitisation plus gender responsive training has led to increased financial inclusion. So in fact, through the programme, over 150,000 workers, of which the majority are women, are now being paid digitally across 70 factories. So they have gone from being unbanked to having their first account. And 20% of the workers, both male and female, have started saving regularly, which is really important. And we've also seen that workers are actively using their accounts. And we found that women conduct on average 8 transactions a month and men are conducting 13 transactions. So there's still a gender difference, but I think it's still really positive that women are conducting 8 transactions a month. And they're only withdrawing money when they need it and using their accounts to send remittances, which is something that they really value. And topping up airtime on their mobile phone is also something that they use very often. We've also found that wage digitisation is helping to empower female workers, which is really significant in a country like Bangladesh, where women are often expected to hand over their wages and not be involved how they're spent. So following the training, women shared with us that they felt more in control, and there was almost a 20% increase in female workers reporting they're making joint decisions with their families how to spend their wages. And this is true for men as well. So women are moving away from allowing other members of the family to control their salary, whilst men are moving away from making decisions on their own. We've also seen an increase in women's confidence about their future financial health. 1 in 8 women were more likely to report that they are confident to meet unexpected costs over the next 2 years. And that's something that was severely tested in March this year. This data was collected beforehand, but we have done some more surveys since then. And whilst the number of people who said they were confident has decreased, there are still people who felt that they were more resilient and they had savings and budgeting techniques which really helped them to weather the early part of the COVID-19 lockdowns. But these results would not be seen by digitization alone. It's something that I cannot stress enough. They come from digitization, having accounts, and the training. So we did some research last year in India with Microsave. We found that 3 years after the kind of government mandated rapid digitization, male and female workers were still withdrawing 100% of their wages on payday. And female workers in particular were struggling to use an ATM and handing over their ATM card to someone else, even a security guard. And one of the factories we work in, some of the women who lacked so much confidence with ATMs, they opened accounts with just checkbooks, which meant every month they had to take half a day off just to go and withdraw their wages. Their male counterparts, who were much more confident with ATM cards, weren't affected in the same way. So you can see there's a really big gender difference as well. And we've also seen through the programme increased business efficiency, which is really important because it makes wage digitization sustainable so that workers will continue to be paid digitally beyond the programme, and also that new workers will be onboarded and start receiving digital wages. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So this is Moshrifa, and I met Moshrifa in November in Dhaka last year. She's a quality inspector at an M&S garment supplier. And Moshrifa told me that before her wages were digitized, she was really nervous about it. But now she preferred it. She'd been paid 3 times into an account. And she said that when she was paid in cash, she just didn't feel safe on payday, and she'd often have to pay to get a rickshaw home instead of walking. And when she sent money to her mother, which she did on a regular basis, she had to go to an agent and join a queue, and she was surrounded by men, which made her feel really uncomfortable. And sometimes afterwards, she'd receive disturbing calls at night if one of the men had overheard her sharing her phone number with the agent, which is what she had to do as part of sending the remittance. But this isn't a problem anymore because she can send money to her family through her payroll account. It's a mobile money account. And it's free too. So before she had to pay 20 taka to send the money, and now she doesn't have to pay anything. And she's also using her phone mobile money account to top up airtime on her phone so she can speak to her family. She doesn't have to go to the market to top up. She can just do that, you know, when she's at home. And she's also started saving more money. And she's saying that the training really helped her because she didn't know how to use an account before, and she wouldn't have opened one otherwise. And she's actually told her friends and her sisters about the benefits of mobile money and helped them to open accounts too. And actually, we've also seen a ripple effect from workers like Moshrifa who've been sharing their experience with their friends and neighbours. Some research by Intermedia found that there'd been a real increase in the number of female non-garment workers who live in communities surrounding garment factories becoming active mobile money account users. And so I think that's a really important to consider how people can become ambassadors if they're receiving a good service and happy with the benefits of it. So yeah, next slide.
Great. So one of the things that Julia asked me to share is a little bit more about where we see this breakdown in financial service delivery. And it falls along the lines of that lovely slide that Nisha had shared that shows the socio-ecological models of, you know, these norms and how relevant they are. And I want to show you a picture of one of the communities in where we work in northern Kenya. And when you look at a picture like this, one, this is very typical of what you see both of housing and also of landscape. And what I want to talk to you a bit about are what the barriers that we see for now financial service delivery, because they happen at the system level, kind of like Nisha outlined earlier. They happen at the community and provider level, and they happen at the household level. When the government of Kenya thinks about service delivery to these areas, well, it really wasn't until 2010 when Kenya had a new constitution put in place that the government began to heavily invest in infrastructural development into the north. And so even today, to reach the communities in which we work, when you go off tarmac, you're often experiencing long drives, and all of a sudden you find yourself in a place of 5,000, 10,000 people who live in homes just like this, places that are easy to reach in the dry season, places that are extremely challenging to reach in the rainy season. When financial service providers who I talk to regularly think about these communities in the north, they think that because of what they look like and what you see in terms of the environment, that there couldn't be a lot of market activity and therefore economic activity happening. So therefore the demand for financial services would be really low. In fact, what we see is actually over 60% of our program participants are, for example, reliant on government cash transfers, which in Kenya are delivered digitally. Well, because of those two, prevailing let's say opinions or perspectives of both how you do infrastructure in the north and also whether or not there's a there for these communities, the onus or burden is put onto the safety net recipient to figure out how to go and get their cash transfers. So for the program participants we work with, to make this very clear, they receive on average maybe 2,000 shillings or $20 a month for a government cash transfer. When you live in a community this far off the A2 highway, where most of the providers are located and where one can be assured there's some degree of liquidity or they can actually get cash, they're going to spend almost half of that cash transfer payment to go and retrieve it. When they go and retrieve that payment, they're challenged by a few things, because liquidity management is not something that is easily undertaken in rural communities, for those of you who are familiar with how this works. Cash, for example, in the north moves at a 10% premium because of security risks. And also, when you have a prevailing notion that there is not sufficient demand, you're not going to spend that extra cost to deliver cash in those areas as a provider. So when a program participant that we work with goes to retrieve their monthly cash transfer from a provider, they'll do a few things. One, they'll bundle it on a quarterly basis, or two, they'll go to the provider and they will be forced to take half of what they have left in kind, flour or sugar or something like that. This is not merely anecdotal. We just ran a recent study with Busara on this to confirm this as well across 3 counties that we work in. I think the other thing around this is that on the individual and community level, we do see, it's always surprising to financial service providers and other service providers that mobile money has a place in these communities. As part of our program delivery, we do provide handsets to the women that we work with. And what we see right away are the individual but very real barriers just to onboarding an individual to a mobile platform. In the communities we work in northern Kenya, people are fluent in the language of their community. So if you're talking about a community in Samburu County, most people speak Samburu. They don't speak Swahili, they don't read Swahili, nor do they read English. And this becomes challenging because delivery of communication around anything digital financial services is done in Swahili or English. They also don't do calculations the same way we might be familiar with. So the business women we work with, when they are calculating notes, in Kenya, the 100 shilling note has an elephant on it. That becomes 1 elephant. And so when you start taking somebody from a very analog environment and having them begin to try and experience and translate that into a USSD environment, we won't even talk about smartphones. There are a lot of hurdles to go through. A friend of mine, Jamie Anderson, by the way, wrote a fantastic paper on this on the Smallholder Financial Diaries, where she talks about these jumps people have to make to convert from an analog environment to a digital environment. And so that in and of itself is a barrier to using financial services. And then we have also, I think, the bigger challenge, and perhaps this is a bit provocative, but I can say this because I used to be a donor. It is hard to pay attention to these areas because now we are getting to the place where it's very difficult to make things work. And so oftentimes our sector, the financial inclusion sector, sometimes we suffer from premature declarations of victory. And the Northern Kenya context is a great example of this on a number of fronts, on the infrastructural front, as well as on the financial inclusion front. There are several visual representations, for example, of how the box has been checked on the north being electrified. Well, what that actually means is that we have towers that have been standing in place for 4 years, but they're not cabled. It's the same for agent network reach and financial service reach. We have several kiosks in the communities where we work where there is a sign for an agent, but there's not anybody there. And I wouldn't be so glib as to say it's because somebody needs to get up and do something. It's hard. And there's a lot of last mile challenges that really require commitment towards delivery. So, those are all these environmental systemic barriers that we just see in very real time when we talk about building financial capability, leveraging digital financial services as a part of that. What I'll share with you as a bit of a transition to the next slide is so how do you then measure whether someone can be resilient financially in this environment? So Julie, if you can go to the next one. The pivot I want to make with you here is that we don't use digital financial services or formal financial services, as I mentioned at the onset. Somebody's getting a barbecue right in the background, so I apologize for the noise. But we don't use that as our only benchmark for is a person financially included? Are they financially capable? As I mentioned earlier, the one thing that I think is unique about the graduation approach is that it does take this multi-sectoral approach to really answer these questions. Can somebody withstand the shock that they are facing at the moment? Can they pay school fees now that the government has given them 6 days to send their children to school in the case of Kenya? And so what you see on the screen are these buckets of what I'll say are criteria. I interchange indicators because on a monthly basis, we look at various performance indicators and we monitor that, but it all feeds into this criteria that we've established. If you look at any graduation program globally, you would see something of a different flavor. We have things around food security, no child going to bed hungry in the last month, households are eating a certain amount of meals a day in the past week. This is particularly important in an area where food scarcity is a real issue. We look at business value, also having multiple sources of income. With pastoralists, if you have livestock as your primary form of livelihood and something happens to your herd and that's your only form of income, you are left totally vulnerable and exposed. And so you need other forms of income. Participation in a savings group. We've even put in minimum thresholds of savings. I'll be honest, that wasn't scientifically calculated. That was just we know that people need something in their account. We are increasingly prioritizing as part of our graduation criteria, girl-child enrollment in school. We work in communities where there's still a lot of conversation, and forgive me for how I describe this, of whether a girl who is married at a young age is worth more than a girl who is educated, because households are having to make very real-time economic decisions that determine the health and viability of their family. And so they are faced with excruciating choices and a lot of also conversations that have extended over time, culturally speaking. And so we are having a lot of conversations about the value add of an educated girl and including them as an important part of our training. So I'll turn it over next to, I believe it's Nisha.
Sorry, I was muted. Thanks, Wendy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about solutions and how do we address some of those deep-rooted gender norms that act as a barrier for building women's financial capability and improving their economic opportunities. Both Ella and Wendy have talked, I think, with very detailed examples, so I won't go through all of these solutions, but inherently the design of the wage digitization project and the graduation project take into account a lot of women's individual preferences, what works for them, using collective action approaches like savings groups to bring women together and build their capacity, engaging men in the process of, shifting what is acceptable within the household in terms of a woman's role. So those are really strong examples of those strategies for changing norms at the level of the individual or the household. The one area that I did want to speak to a little bit more is, the socioecological model shows that there's factors at multiple levels that result in barriers for women. And what we need to do is, while working on strategies that target the individual or the household, we also need to target the entire system and create opportunities for behavior change. And one strategy that has shown some promise is the use of mass media, because you can go to scale and reach a larger audience. Television, print, radio, these are very powerful mediums. And these, without even trying, they are constantly putting out messages of what is acceptable behavior, what are acceptable roles for men and women in certain contexts. So there's an opportunity to leverage these channels and change the narrative and show positive role models and examples of how it is acceptable for, more girls should be sent to school or stay in school, or delaying marriage, or, women having a bank account, being able to use mobile money. We've seen some examples from financial institutions in the Middle East who've run social media or media-based campaigns that show, women as entrepreneurs, because there's not that many in that society. And so, yes, that women can be entrepreneurs and they can run their own business. There's a very interesting example from Afghanistan, and it's very successful, of using Sesame Street and a female character that shows how, all parents should send their daughters to school. And this is one of the most successful examples of behavior change communication at a country level. So I think we need to think beyond our, individual or programmatic level changes, and how do we couple those with broader behavior change at the level of the system and all the components of that system. Next slide. I'll transition to the last part of this discussion in terms of COVID-19 and its impact on women. You've probably seen and read a lot of this. There's been a number of discussions, blogs, publications, which highlight how women face an increased care burden now that their kids are at home. And this is not just in developing countries, it's across the world. They have more responsibility if they're working, they're taking care of their job, their business, their household, education of their children. In countries where there are social protection programs and cash transfers are being offered, women are less likely to benefit from them, often because they don't have an account, they don't have an ID, they don't have a mobile phone, they don't know how to use it. And then there's also, while women are not usually in charge of making decisions about how to spend money, often they are responsible for managing the household budget. And when the incomes have dried up at the household level, they have to stretch their budgets and make trade-offs about where do they spend the money, the limited resources they have. So all of this has compounded women's ability to use financial services and benefit from them. So from a normative perspective, one of the things that we often hear is moments of crisis, such as this COVID-19 crisis, also present an opportunity for change. Women are taking on new roles. Men are taking on new roles. We've seen examples of how men who are at home a lot more are contributing to care responsibilities within the household. So the real opportunity for us as a community is, how do we create a new normal? We are seeing more women being onboarded into digital financial services, more women actually going to access their social protection or cash payment through a mobile phone. How do we make that the norm and not just let it be a one-off thing, so that we can build back better from here? I'll pass it on.
Great, thank you, Nisha. Yeah, I'm going to just share a few examples as to how we have adapted our training to the kind of coronavirus new normal that we're in. And as will be familiar scenario to many of you, we had to put all of our in-person training and meetings on hold in March, because most of our training has been face-to-face, and that's something that is really important to be able to build the messages and to spend time with people. And so one of the ways that we did that is we adapted our training to be delivered remotely through Zoom and through Google Meet. Because the factories are now open, the workers are there, and so they can still attend the training even though our trainers aren't able to travel there. And you'll see in this picture on the left-hand side, there's a group of workers here who are receiving their training, and it's really important that they are following coronavirus safety measures, and they all have masks on, which means that for the trainer it can be quite hard for them to kind of hear what they're saying, and they're not sitting so close to the microphone. And so one way that's really important to get around that is to work with the welfare officer at the factory or someone from HR who can come and facilitate. And we also build their capacity beforehand to say, can you make sure that the women are participating, so they're not just sitting quietly at the back, and to really encourage that. So that really helps working closely with our trainers. And you can see the trainer on the laptop at the front of the picture there. And we also take the opportunity to show videos on coronavirus prevention methods at the beginning of each session, so that not only are we, it's a HERfinance session, but I think it's really important opportunity to get these messages across. We also had developed HERfinance Digital Wages tech learning tools, very well timed. We developed those in towards the end of 2019, and you can see the tablet there on the right hand side of the screen. And so within those, the training is based on our HERfinance curriculum and includes videos and animation and quizzes. And it's a really effective way of engaging the workers, increasing their learning outcomes, but also building their confidence and digital literacy. And these have been really useful in the time of coronavirus as well. And they can be used, they were designed to be used in groups of 5, but they can also be used in individuals. And so the factories have can invest in the tablets, and then the workers can use the training. And we also, those are available in, we've done them in Bangla, in Khmer and Arabic. We've had really good response from those. And we also wanted to make sure that the videos and animation in the tech tools and all the information within them was going to be more easily accessible. So we've put them all on YouTube, so they can be played in the factories, as well as just kind of picking out a particular video on a particular subject to show in the training. We also, we used to do a lot of in-person feedback sessions, and so we've turned those into phone surveys to get feedback and insights from workers, to understand their situation, to see what we can do to adapt the training to support the challenges that they're facing. And one of the things that we faced with this, it was much harder to reach female workers, because either they didn't have time to join the call, which we made sure was only like 15-20 minutes, so still obviously women have got different time pressures, or their phones were answered by a male family member who wouldn't let us talk to the woman. Also, several workers said they didn't want to participate in the call because they thought it might be a fraud call. And actually, we were really pleased to get that response, because it meant that they had really, because that's, fraud calls are an issue in Bangladesh. And so it felt, we were actually happy that they had absorbed those messages. And then finally, something else that we do, which is really important, is working in collaboration. And so As you're probably aware, in Bangladesh, there has been a rapid wage digitization as part of the government COVID-19 response, which led to over 1 million workers being paid digitally for the first time in April, which is amazing. I mean, if you think we helped digitize 150,000 workers in 5 years, and in April, 1 million workers were digitized. They did not get any training due to the rapid nature of that, and also because of the COVID restrictions. And so whilst it's wonderful that they have access to those accounts, it's really important to find ways for them to get the training, especially for women, to build the confidence. And so we've been working across brands and suppliers and financial service providers and workplace program providers and everybody else kind of working in this space to find ways to scale up the training, to share our open source materials, and to help integrate them into their training that they might have, because we recognize that this is something that we have to do collectively. Okay, you can't work in silos on something. It's the kind of being greater than the sum of everybody's parts for that. So yeah, I think adapting to the coronavirus situation and finding ways to build capacity and capability for workers, especially women, continues to be work in progress. So yeah, so next slide.
So in the context of Kenya, I would be keen here to differentiate what I described really specifically to northern Kenya and not what you see probably in more population dense areas of the country to some extent. There's a few key things that we saw the government do. Kenya declared early with regards to the pandemic. So after about 3 cases, the country literally shut down. There was a huge push from the very first day of announcements around coronavirus. We were getting multiple text messages a day from Safaricom saying, avoid corona, avoid cash, use M-Pesa. And what's important to understand about that is actually where we operate, because of the digital challenges that I outlined earlier. People don't prioritize digital as the means of transaction. It's kind of the last resort. So in fact, cash has a huge, it has such value to people, both to be able to signify that they are growing their assets, but it feels tangibly more secure than what digital financial services can provide. So with these messages coming out, the communities where we operate, they're not reading, they can't read the messages, for one, but two, you get these mixed signals because all of a sudden all this cash you're sitting on is contagious. And so there's something interesting about that. What the government did do, thankfully, is that it decided to sort of activate existing safety net channels with new safety net distribution. What wasn't done at the same time was sort of modernizing that distribution system to ensure that those funds that were being delivered digitally were actually reaching the intended participants. So again, we see the same challenge as I described earlier, where people are going to agents, there's not enough float or liquidity there, so they have to take out their cash transfer, in flour or sugar. They're spending a huge amount in travel, or they may not even know about it as well. There's a lot of different barriers that arose from it. Just like what Ella had mentioned, mentorship is a critical component of our program's approach, especially that in-person mentorship, because of the need to have a trusted relationship and source for information that you could really rely on for the duration of your time in the program. So when the government's orders went into place and there was a ban on group gatherings beginning in early April, as well as a deep fear of contagion of the virus, because in the north as well, it was highly undercapacitated to respond to coronavirus. In Samburu County, which is one of the counties we work in, one of their big county press announcements in March was that they could test 8 people for COVID-19. That didn't mean that they could actually administer the test, but actually the test, no ICU beds in the north. So this fear of like, if I get this virus, what do I do with it? Where do I go? How do I respond? That was very real. And so we did not do any in-person mentoring up until September. And frankly, I think a lot of people also wanted to stay distanced from other people, especially from other parts of the country. We decided to undertake some new approaches for us with using IVR, or interactive voice recognition, as a complement to mentorship. And as well, we had our mentors individually calling the program participants they work with. We went with using IVR because just using smartphones as a tool was not feasible for us for a number of reasons, which I can explain later. Two, and on the literacy challenge, using text messaging wouldn't work. So we needed to use voice, and especially provide delivery of content in local language. We undertook and we're still in a 3-month partnership with BOMA to try and see, is this quite feasible? And we have a lot of really interesting lessons learned to date. For us, we were very excited about IVR. We spent a month onboarding our program participants and our staff to get ready to figure out how to use it. But for communities where even using a basic handset for picking calls and trusting the source of information, when now you're asking them to use that handset as an interactive device, there's some learning curves there that we hadn't fully appreciated, even though we had done the training around it. Also, just for those of you who may be thinking about doing this, people can't always pick up the phone when it calls. And so identifying an appropriate time of day, especially for women, when they can step aside from household duties, which have increased under COVID-19, to take a phone call without bringing on any suspicion to what they might be doing, was really important. The other thing that we found that mattered quite a bit was just providing coaching on alternative livelihood options. One of the things Kenya did was shut down its livestock markets, which again in pastoralist communities is critical lifeline for income sourcing. And so our coaches went and provided ideas on what else could be done through market linkages. And this sounds more sophisticated than perhaps what it was, but other than to say that here are some other viable options. So the picture here on the screen are of women who were sheep traders, and they realized that that was not going to go anywhere when the markets were shut down. Incidentally, actually, what's really interesting, just so you can know, is that for most people in the communities we work with, they didn't do a mass sell-off of livestock at the onset of COVID. We've had a nice long rainy seasons, and so a majority of the populations we work with took the risk of fattening up livestock as opposed to selling it off. These women leveraged their savings as a business group to go into mask making, and they recognized both there's a business opportunity and there was a community need. So they've been selling masks, and then they have been giving masks away free to the elderly. And I think it just speaks so wonderfully to how entrepreneurs are willing to take risks in really risky environments and try something out. And that's where we see the mentorship approach really kind of providing that additional support for people to feel free that they can undertake that, combined with knowing I have a savings cushion. I can try something new. And so what we have seen in our data is that these pivots on livelihood have worked. And what we've heard from the program participants is that the one-to-one calling from the mentors, some of the IVR messaging, and I see a comment already made about we'll share findings, but we don't have them ready yet. The IVR messaging, once people really got familiar with how to use the platform, the messaging about, hey, don't forget to save and don't forget to budget, and you can do just these nudge messages, they were really helpful reminders in what is otherwise a noisy environment of COVID-19 survival. So I'll turn it over, I think, to Julia to take us home.
Yes, thank you so much, the Nisha and Ella and Wendy. This was really fantastic. I just want to sort of reflect back some of the themes that I was hearing, and then I want to turn it over to some of the listener or viewers and the questions that are already coming in, which are fantastic. So, what I'm hearing is that really knowing who you're serving, really understanding their constraints, their reality, their existing knowledge, and where they are physically, where they are sort of skill wise, is really, really important. Investing in that, knowing that, understanding that, using IVR instead of text message, using the PA system in the factory to kind of really continue to nudge, if you will, information and communication really can be effective. Privacy, confidence, security, these are all themes that you were all three really hammering home. These are important to women. These are not something, it's not a nice to have. These are critical components to how you reach and how you address and how you design your capability building. And the other theme that really came through for me is this is a long-term investment. This isn't like a 6 months or even year or 18 months. We're talking an investment in the individual for their life, as well as their community and their children. And I think that this mindset is really a difficult one to get, say an MFI or even a fintech to kind of think through. How do we invest in this person? Why is this worth it? And how do we sort of change the system in that socio-ecological model to really enable that kind of investment? So let me turn to some of the questions. The questions you see on the screen here, some questions we had sort of in mind to answer, but I think answering the listeners' questions or viewers' questions take priority. So, someone asked about, a really practical question about tools. How do we build this capability? How do we change these norms? What are the tools we're using? And I can start with Ella. Cash out habits are a difficult one to change. How is her project really addressing, what tools are you using, practical tools are you using to get these messages across and change this behavior?
Yeah, absolutely. People are used to living in a cash society. You need cash to buy your groceries, you need cash to pay your rent, you need cash to pay school fees. And so, yeah, it is a big change to go from cash to digital wages. And definitely we see at the beginning that when workers are digitized, the first thing they will do is withdraw 100% of their wages as they build the confidence that they can access that to be able to pay for all of their cash expenses. And so developing the ecosystem is also really important. Kind of focusing on financial capability here, and the way to do that is to really help demonstrate the benefits of it. And so in Bangladesh, it really is around sending remittances is something really valuable. The garment workers are usually migrated to Dhaka or to Chittagong, and they need to send money home to their families. And so, and time again, I've spoken to garment workers when I've been able to travel to Bangladesh, and they always say that, if their mum rings on the way to work and says, look, I need money today, they can do it there and then, or they can send it at lunchtime. They don't have to wait till the evening or to the weekend to go to the agent, to the busy market, and to send money. And so for us, the greatest tool really is that persuading them and having the peer educators to show this is how you can do that.
Yeah, that was another theme that came through too, is really having people around you to reinforce those norms and sort of increase your confidence and champion what you're doing. Wendy, do you have anything to add in terms of practical tools on building this capability?
I don't know that I would add anything more to practical tools, but I would add a bit of a myth busting opportunity here. Sometimes when it comes to last mile, quote unquote, and use of digital financial services, there is an assumption that can exist that people don't want to use it. And I have seen firsthand, and we have studies firsthand that show people get it. They get why it makes sense to use it. And then I've watched people take 15 steps to do something in digital in what they can do in cash in one step. And that's where the conversion story begins to fall apart. And so while there are plenty, I feel like there's plenty of appetite for it, but there really has to be a better, compelling use case story that's super practical and that meets people where they are at specific.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You've frozen a little, Wendy. Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can. Sorry, you cut out just a little bit. It's okay.
Some people say that's not scalable, nor is it profitable. But the other thing is that providers like us, providers like the World Food Program and others, we can show a lot of demand side data to say like, oh, there's a big opportunity for service providers to close that gap on the last mile too. So I answered your question roundabout, but I hope you get the point.
No, absolutely. No, and I think, meeting your customer where they are is a great transition to the next question for Nisha. There were some questions around the social media and mass media normative shifts that you were talking about, and what do you know in terms of the evidence and the impact on how were normative shifts and change measured when using a mass media or social media approach?
Sure. So the example that I cited from Afghanistan about using Sesame Street and the character Zari, there was a RCT done on that intervention, and I'm sure I can find the document and share it. But there was rigorous evaluation done on the impacts and how it changed perceptions on within family members on how their views about girls' education and roles that girls can take on. So there are a number of other similar behavior change interventions that have been studied in depth to generate evidence. The point is that the way these programs were designed, they were designed with a lot of rigor at the beginning, what messages should be sent. So it wasn't just taking any messages, but it was, constantly thinking about what is the impact of the message, what is it supposed to convey to the audience, and then measuring whether it was having that intended impact. The other example about a financial service provider using social media to change perceptions around women's roles and women as entrepreneurs was an example from Turkey. And because of the nature of that financial market and the target population of that bank, the women that they were targeting actually have access to smartphones and are active on social media. So it was a well-designed behavior change. It was designed more as a campaign. It wasn't behavior change at the level of their partners, but it was trying to put a broader message out to the society within which TED works. And the way they measured their success was, how many people viewed that message, how many retweeted it or shared it shared the YouTube link, and it was somewhere in the range of 33 million for that specific video. That was 2 years ago, and they've done the campaign, kind of building on the messages every year since then. And it's not tied to a specific product, but they have a women's banking division and they have products that are for women. So it ties in with their overall strategy. Another example that has been cited in a few places is some work done by Women's World Banking in Kenya, where they used a popular soap opera to talk about, make women, there were characters that were opening bank accounts, and there was a partnership with specific banks who were offering those services. So it helped women build confidence in, that, and see that banking is for them. Mm-hmm. And then they could go to that bank and actually access those services. And that intervention, I think, led to somewhere around 130,000 plus new sign-ons. So again, there was evaluation and there was data collected on the effectiveness of that kind of messaging. So the key is to design these kinds of mass media or social media or TV or radio. In certain cases, those are the channels that work better. But you have to design your campaigns based on rigorous research and evidence and who you're trying to target and what the reality is, and they have to be contextualized.
Yes, and I also know of a soap opera that aired in South Africa that was also rigorously measured in terms of impact. So that's an interesting use of a story, a narrative to change and influence behavior. So a lot of this capability building of the end client, the customer, the user, really relies on the ability of the frontline staff to convey those messages and deeply understand why they're doing what they're doing, and answer any follow-up questions that may occur from the customers who are hearing this for the first time, perhaps. And I would love to hear some examples of tools and tips and training that you've all used or seen used around building up your frontline staff capability as well. And I'm agnostic to who goes first. And I will pick someone. Ella, go.
Yeah, I think that's also something that's really important as a part of what we do, is to make sure that the trainers are really thinking about, for us, where we provide training for garment workers, for male and female garment workers, is so that when that training is delivered, it's done in a gender responsive way. And you sit in the training and the women are sat together and the men are together, and the women are quiet and the men are keen to participate. And so you don't want to discourage that, but you also need to make sure that women have a voice and they can take part. And so we spend time with our trainers to help build their gender capacity, because sometimes they will just say, well, that's just normal. Like, of course the men would be speaking first because they're from that area and community and part of those gender norms. And so one of the tools that we do, and we've got the HERfinance training curriculum, we actually recently have worked with a gender expert to keep going through it and to keep strengthening it and making sure that there's role plays that speak to women, that show positive gender roles. And actually talking about the soap operas that you have in the tech tool that I mentioned, we have a series of small films which follows a group of 5 actors who are garment workers across their kind of financial lives, and you see one in each of the training modules, and workers really like it because they see themselves in it and it kind of speaks to them. And so I think just showing that. So I haven't really answered your question, but just so tools for trainers. Yeah, and I think it's just that kind of gender awareness is just really important part of that, and making sure that's considered at all levels. So everybody needs to consider it. And the same for financial service providers. We also work with them to help them to understand the financial needs of female garment workers, because it's a new area to them, it's a new market segment, and it's something that they definitely need support with. So we encourage them to watch our videos and help them think it through. But also what we found works best with them is they like data. So we get the data and we share that with them. So that's an effective way of getting them to think about gender and realizing that, oh, actually, there are that many women, and those could become our customers, and why aren't we reaching them? And don't they understand English? Like, surely using this English platform where you're from a small village in Bangladesh, like, oh, okay. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, step 1. Wendy, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add, in addition to a gendered response, local matters. We have seen time and time again when trainers from outside the communities come in to deliver a training, The audience sits, engages, and then walks away. And that's the end of that engagement. And we have a lot of stories from the communities to tell us like, yeah, we didn't go back after that. And the reason local matters is when you think about it, it's kind of screamingly obvious. When you have trainers who are going to be meeting, in our case, they go and deliver trainings on a monthly basis.
Oh, she's frozen again.
Weddings and so
Oh,
on.
okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay.
Sorry.
And the piece of this is these trainers are also going to be talking about very sensitive information. Finance is a sensitive topic. And those of us who are more familiar with it, we just talk about it all day long. So we don't think of it as necessarily as sensitive, but at a household level, it's very sensitive. And then when you layer on other components, these subcomponents around household decision making, and even like the importance in our case of, girl child enrollment in school. We even talk about, we have family planning training sessions. These are all like, you've just opened up, all the drawers in the dresser. And that requires then somebody that you can count on from a community perspective and from the group's perspective. So we do a lot of training with the trainers about the importance of the sensitivity of these topics. And it's quite amazing how respectfully they handle and carry this material. And what we see afterwards is that when people leave the program, they don't want to leave the mentor. And in many cases, the mentors feel obliged to support the business groups long after they have exited the program because this relationship is so critical. And I think the thing about local too is that these trainers know how to read between the lines and of what's not being said. And so like it would be amazing if, and I think there's room still for us to look at hybridized models, but we can never do away, nor should we, with the local delivery.
Absolutely agreed. A good gender landscape prior to any sort of curriculum adaptation or program implementation is always key to understanding how to make those adaptations and how to speak to that audience. I have like a million follow-up questions. I'd love to hear a little bit more, Ella, about clearly BSR has been really investing in financial capability of this among women in terms of their digitizing wages, and COVID has really forced a lot of factories in Bangladesh to digitize now. What kind of comparisons are you seeing between those factories that have invested in this information and those that have not? And what kind of pitfalls are you seeing, if any, between the women who kind of understand now how to use those digital wages and mobile money, and those who don't?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And for those who already digitized before this, that meant they were very smoothly able to access the government COVID response package, which enabled them to pay workers' wages for several months. For those who had not digitized, there was I think a pretty crazy month where something like 800 garment factories digitized in a really short space of time, and it was very chaotic. And talking to the financial service providers, they were being bombarded with questions, and to deal with that in such a short space of time. So I think it was pretty stressful for the managers who had not already digitized, and for the workers, I imagine for them at least they knew that going through this meant they were going to get paid, because otherwise, the worry, if you don't get paid, then COVID doesn't matter about COVID being a health crisis, it becomes an economic crisis very, very quickly. And so for them, it was just by any means to get wages. But the microfinance opportunities who do the garment worker diaries in Bangladesh have been conducting some really interesting surveys, and they found from, I think they speak to around 1,800 workers on a weekly basis. And many of the workers who were digitized for the first time were saying, oh, I don't know how to use this. And so we're just handing over control to somebody else. And so it's good because it gets money to the family, but it's not necessarily getting money to that worker. And so that's something that really does need to be addressed. Otherwise, they won't benefit from it. The other thing that we see is that now that the government package has finished, then some of the factories are going back to cash because that's what they're used to. And so the other concern is to make sure that, you know, they've had this taste of wage digitization to help them to build the confidence to continue. And so we're also working with managers. This is really important to work with managers and workers on that for the sustainability of it.
Yeah, so we have about 5 minutes left, which is both not surprising and also, wow, that went by so fast. So I have one final question before we wrap up. Nisha, I'm wondering, you know, you and I have talked about this before, but women are not, you know, a monolith, right? There's wide varieties, and we can see with this conversation, you know, they live in different places, they have different livelihoods. Women are very different among them. They're not, you know, one segment. So, you know, what is the importance of customer segmentation, and particularly of understanding the sort of needs among women who you're serving, and how do we take that into account when we're building capability?
Yeah, yeah, that is absolutely true. Women, we say women, and we mean all women, all, you know, more than 50% of the global population. But the reality is, you know, context matters. So where they are located, because norms especially are very context specific. Age is a very important criteria depending on where they are in their life cycle. An adolescent, a young girl versus an adolescent young woman versus, you know, a married young woman with children, and then, you know, what age, like after that, once the children are grown up and they're older. So at each of these levels, what a woman can do and is able to do in terms of accessing economic opportunities changes, because the certain rules change for her based on her life cycle. So I think spending some time in collecting some initial sex disaggregated data, and then actually getting into the nuances of that, not just saying we reach so many women or these are the needs of the women's market, but actually starting to break that down by location, by age, by, you know, economic or social status, might help us create more texture in how we understand the preferences of, you know, women and that subset of women, and then design for them. So starting with the woman as opposed to women is important.
Absolutely. I feel like that's a really fantastic way to end this. You know, building capability, building confidence, understanding, skills, really comes down to, you know, who are you targeting? What is their sort of reality, and how do you bring that information to that person so that you can have that long lasting and sustained impact, and yeah, life improvement, hopefully, self-directed life improvement. So I want to thank my colleagues on the panel here, Ella, Wendy, Nisha. Thank you so much for your time and your sharing your tools and wisdom. All of our email addresses and contact information are on the slide here. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to us. This was a really rich discussion, and I think I'd like to think that we made it a little more complicated, which is always a good thing. So, thank you everybody for listening and asking these fantastic questions. And, you know, stay tuned to the rest of the day. There are so many other wonderful events happening for Women's Financial Inclusion Day, which is just so fantastic. And for the rest of the week, CFI has so many wonderful events, webinars, podcasts, quizzes, etc. So check it all out. And yeah, thank you very much, everybody.